For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu.
She's just seeing a world that is so self-satisfied. And the only way that she can get through to them for a different kind of life, to call them to something that's higher, deeper, and richer, is to show suffering, to show this reality that most people are buying themselves away from suffering. They are solving their problems with their money. They are seeking happiness in all material goods. And so the way that she does kind of rips all that away, and she makes everything stark and violent. And she's doing it through fiction to show this reality that kind of pulls back the curtain on our false ideas of happiness, to show us what truth is. And so there's this grace that happens that I think really encapsulates all of what Flannery O'Connor is trying to do in her fiction, that when you open yourself up to a spiritual way of seeing the world, it's going to hurt, but it's also going to allow you to receive grace.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. The first Flannery O'Connor story I ever read was A Good Man is Hard to Find. And even now, as I rethink the very title of that story, boy, is that true. Definitely in Flannery O'Connor's world, but maybe the whole world over. And yet, we should note, hard to find, but not impossible. In fact, it's often those ugly, mean, disgusting, scandalizing, violent, weird, or downright hateful characters in Flannery O'Connor's stories that become the vessels of grace delivered. My guest on the show today is Jessica Hooten Wilson, the Fletcher Jones Endowed Chair of Great Books at Pepperdine University, and by far the person who's taught me the most about O'Connor. Jessica is the author of numerous books of literary criticism and is a champion for reading. And earlier this year, she finished a decade-long project to release Flannery O'Connor's unfinished novel, Why Did the Heathen Rage?, which was left to us as 378 manuscript pages of work in progress when Flannery died in 1964 at just 39 years old. Given the countless hours Jessica has spent parsing out O'Connor's work, there's no one better to ask for how to read Flannery O'Connor. So in this conversation, Jessica opens up about Flannery's life, her unique perspective as a writer, the theological and moral principles operative in her work, all as an immense invitation to read O'Connor and find the beauty of God's grace that emerges from the weirdness and the peculiarity of life, all the way to the most horrendous of evils. Now, spoilers do follow, and intentionally. As part of our conversation, we discuss Greenleaf, a short story that contains Jessica's favorite Flannery O'Connor character, Mrs. Greenleaf. And if you read that short story first, you'd get the most out of this conversation. Quick internet search pulls one up right away. It's the story of a saint, Mrs. Greenleaf, who makes a daily practice of snipping stories from the newspapers. Not just any stories, though. The morbid ones, the heartbreaking ones, the too much ones. Mrs. Greenleaf then ritualistically buries them in the ground, lays on top of them, and prays, epitomizing Flannery's belief that, quote, you will have found Christ when you are more concerned with other people's sufferings than your own. Mrs. Greenleaf prays, Jesus stabbed me in the heart. Like a figure of Teresa of Avila, she's asking to be pierced with the pain of sin and suffering in the world. Look, I told you it was violent. I told you it was scandalous. Let's look for the grace in it. Thanks for listening today. Jessica, I'm so delighted to be talking to you about one of my favorite authors, Flannery O'Connor.
Yes, absolutely. It's so funny. Flannery is one of those writers that no one knew about when I was young. And now it seems like she's, a favorite among Christians and really maybe controversial even.
Yeah, it can be a lightning rod. I think I know more people who love Flannery O'Connor than hate her, but there definitely are the haters.
Yeah. I used to talk about Flannery like a litmus test. I would say that you really knew what kind of person you were and whether you'd be friends with someone, if they loved her or hated her.
Yeah. And in my case, I was introduced to her a lot later in life. It wasn't part of my literary formation. And so being introduced to her was like opening up a different world of literature, but also I'd have to say a different world of Christianity for me.
Yeah. She was she formed me. So I don't have that same perspective. People ask me questions about Flannery and like when I came to Flannery, I was 15. She formed my faith probably more than any pastor or teacher in my life.
That is amazing. So we're going to be discussing the short story Greenleaf, which is your favorite Flannery O'Connor short story. And so you had this wonderful suggestion about how to start.
Yeah. So Flannery is one of those readers that teaches you how to read. So if you read her collection, Mystery and Manners, she just walks you through how she reads. And the way she does it is she's grounded in this tradition of reading that goes back to the early church fathers and mothers, as far as picking up a scripture and reading it, not just literally, but also spiritually, keeping in mind the Bible as the model. Imitate the way that scriptures has a literal and spiritual reality coming together. So one of the things that I do when I try to teach students how to do this is to read closely. So I usually have a student start and I'm like, okay, I want you to start reading the first paragraph of Greenleaf for me, Mrs., and then I make them stop. And I kind of walk through like every single word, because what they're used to doing is they want to read the whole paragraph and then they want to summarize it for you.
Yeah.
And there's so much you miss in reading Flannery when you don't pay attention to the words. So when we look at Mrs. May, so we have this identification of the title, not the title character, the protagonist, we can call her that.
Yeah.
But
protagonists are blurry in O'Connor, of course.
Right. Because all of her characters are, they're not really heroes. They're such a amalgamation of both saint and sinner every single time. And Mrs. May is no different. But what they notice immediately is Mrs. May is not Greenleaf. Yeah. So we have title is different from the first character we're introduced to and the first perspective. So they're already ready for this kind of distance between those two. That dissonance produces a question in your reader. Also, the fact that Mrs. Mays, she's not even the subject of the first sentence, right? Grammatically, she's not the subject. And she loses her subjecthood by being turned into a possessive adjective in the very first word. And so by becoming possessive, which of course we'll see in her character if you start reading through her character, but by becoming possessive, she's lost her agency as a person.
My goodness. And we haven't gotten past 2 words.
Crazy. So that's one of the things I love doing is when you read Flannery that closely, and she really does allow you to do that. I tell students with Flannery, everything you need to know about the whole story is given to you in the first paragraph. And so you have to read her stories multiple times the way you'd have to read, once you've read all of the Bible, the first time, if you just read the Old Testament, you read it differently after you've read the New Testament. It reveals how to read the Old Testament. And so Flannery's stories are very similar in that way, that she's in that tradition of writing that forces you to look at it more closely, to look at it several times.
Yeah. So let's get to the third word.
So let me you can go all the way through this paragraph that way. So Mrs. May, so she becomes this possessive adjective. Mrs. May, bedroom. So we have this intimate setting and this idea of what she finds to be intimate that she doesn't want invaded, the space that she's protecting.
Yeah.
So Mrs. May's bedroom window, which should be something that should be see-through, that should be an outlet or a portal. And yet, of course, what we'll see is that she tries to hide, or she tries to shut portals. She tries to veil herself off, was low and faced on the east. Whoa. So all of a sudden we have this identification of the altar in a church.
Yeah, that's right.
Wait, what would be on the altar of a church, low and east, and the bull? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's what you would have on an altar is you have the bull, you have the sacrifice on the altar. And here we have the bull silvered in the moonlight, stood under it, his head raised as if he listened, like some patient God come down to woo her. So we have the bull being read not just literally in this instance. He's now being given a figurative or spiritual identity, right? Like a patient God come down to woo her. Yeah. Now, anybody who's read Europa and the Bull, this is the Europa and the Bull story. And if you read it, figuratively or spiritually, you have Zeus, as in God, coming down into the shape of the sacrifice by which he woos his beloved to him.
Wow. We've gone through one sentence.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. And as you go through, I'll do a little bit more quickly just for the sake of time, but like, so the clouds cross the moon and it blackens him, and it goes back and forth between, if you read this passage, the clouds highlighting him, it's drifting in and out. So the light is kind of on and off of him. So it's very apocalyptic in the sense of veiling and unveiling him. Yep. It's exposing him and revealing him. It's also kind of a call to the reader to pay attention to the light and the dark, to pay attention to two sides of things, to pay attention to both what's being revealed and what's being hidden.
Right.
Right. Opening, it's kind of setting the reader's tone. What's interesting is the contrast, because as that's happening to the bull, in which the clouds are going over the moon, and sometimes it's teaching you how to both see and unsee. Right.
Right.
At the same time, she takes the blinds and opens them. But notice the difference between the perspective. If you have blinds, she's actually hiding things from herself. It's not this idea that some things are exposed and then some things are hidden. It's the idea that she can cover up pieces of reality. She can actually just create purposeful blind spots. She shuts herself off to the God. She shuts her eyes to things like immediately when she sees him.
Yes.
So there's this contrast between what the moon and the clouds are doing versus what she's doing artificially with the blinds. This is intensified by the fact that you have the silver moonlight and she turns on a pink artificial lamp in the room. So she's lighting herself with this artificial, this man-madeness instead of the natural light, right? That is going to give her greater sight. She's shutting off sight. Of course, that whole idea of what you see or do not see or how you see is the point of the story, right? By the time you get to the end, it'll be the light that was she saw light for the first time and she could not bear it. She found it unbearable.
Yeah.
And so we see in intimation from the beginning that she is having problems with how to see and what kind of light she can handle. She can handle the pink artificial light. She can't handle the light of the moon. She shuts out the light of the moon, and later she'll shut out the light of God, obviously, at this very last part. The other, signifier that tells you who the bull is, in addition to the classical image of Zeus. And in the classical image, if you remember the Europa story, he has that wreath on his head because Europa binds the flowers together and create flowers around him. So it is signifying him, right? The bull is symbolic of that. But also he raises his head to show a crown on his head that also then signifies it's a hedge wreath and the crown of thorns.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have, and even the word, he's described as a patient God.
Yeah.
He's the suffering God come down with his crown of thorns, in which he's bowing himself, lowering his head before her and showing who he is.
Yeah.
And she shuts her blinds. And that's how the story opens. So we've learned so much about Mrs. May and about the point of the story if we're able to see it. Because if you're not able to read her spiritually, what happens is you're like, oh, there's a bull and this old lady shuts the blinds.
That's right. It seems so utterly ordinary or provincial or just, this is the stuff of ordinary life, but it's infused with a grace. And so what's amazing about this paragraph is even the fact that she's walking the reader through one of the challenges the reader herself must face when asked with the question, like, can you see what's going on in this story? Like, can you receive the grace through this story? Or are you just going to shut the blinds and turn on your pink artificial light?
Yeah, absolutely. And, when people talk to me about Flannery and they're like, I just didn't get it. Flannery is only going to reward those who are the kind of readers that will slow down. She knows that there will be few who are able to sit down and read her slowly, because the mass of people have been trained by culture for plot, right? For immediate gratification, what Flannery called the instant answer.
Yeah.
And he knows that all of those people are going to have hold of the wrong horror, again, to use her words, right? They're going to find her story horrific for all the wrong reasons because they read it too quickly and they're not taking the time to go through each word and pay attention. And I think that's the same thing with Bible readers, right?
Yeah.
And she knew that Bible readers want the instant uplift. They don't sit down and read for context and read at a spiritual level. They don't try to be read by the text, to receive the text. Instead, they're picking it apart or moving it quickly through it for what they want.
I think we need to really hone in on the phrase, the wrong kind of horror, because, and this I think will transition us a little bit to a little bit of genre, but also just, I think, a core conceptual or an analytic principle for how to read Flannery O'Connor. And that's like seeing her work through the lens of horror or the grotesque. And the wrong kind of horror is, of course, a really evocative and wonderful phrase. So I wonder if we could talk about some of those frames. We're going to be coming back to Greenleaf, no doubt. But give us a little bit of a sense for, across her work, why has she been associated with a horror genre or the grotesque?
Yeah, especially in most of her work that predates 1960s. She is writing in, just imagine, go back in time. So imagine the 1950s and 60s. There's this idea of, pre-1960s, or really just 50s. Like there's a time of post-war materialism. America is really benefiting everybody.
The baby boom.
Right. And so you'll see images in kind of Wise Blood in her first novels of Coca-Cola, really starting to come up in dominance in Georgia. And she writes this great essay in response to a Life magazine piece in which they said, who speaks for America today? And her answer was the advertising agencies. They're the ones who speak for America today. So I'm just giving that as context, that she's just seeing a world that is so self-satisfied. And the only way that she can get through to them for a different kind of life, to call them to something that's higher, deeper, and richer, is to show suffering, to show this reality that most people are buying themselves away from suffering. They are solving their problems with their money. They are seeking happiness in all material goods. And so the way that she does kind of rips all that away, and she makes everything stark and violent, and she's doing it through fiction. I mean, she was not in and of herself a violent person. She was not someone who was like going around, right? Like she is not loving violence. And I think that was when we say wrong horror, that's what people are misunderstanding. She's showing violence in fiction to show this reality that kind of pulls back the curtain on our false ideas of happiness, to show us what truth is.
And I mean, there's an important distinction around use and enjoyment of something, right? And in this case, it really does seem like O'Connor's deftly using violence for, well, this is an open for debate, of course, and this is where it gets interesting, but for redemptive purposes. And so that's a really wonderful insight. I wonder if you could say a little bit more, without too many spoilers, about where else horror, the grotesque, violence really shows up in her work.
So in her first novel, Wise Blood, which Evelyn Waugh said there was no way that a young lady wrote that, right? Because the novel ends with the main character blinding himself with lime, right? And basically he takes out his eyes, and he's wrapping himself with barbed wire, and he walks with rocks in his shoes. And so he is taking on this kind of extreme asceticism that was really masochistic in the Middle Ages. And what was the attempt at that time, hundreds of years ago, was to train the body to put the soul first and to put spiritual things before physical things. So if you could train your body to overcome the physical, so that you could think of higher things, right? That was the good. And so she has her character do this in the 20th century. It looks so strange. And she's not giving you this violence to imitate. And that's the misunderstanding, of course. Yeah. She's trying to show that violence. She's showing you that image of someone who's trying to train this life he's lived that has been totally physical, that has been really wrapped up in the material world. And now he's trying to train himself for a new sight. And the only thing he can do to really run away from American capitalism, American commercialism, American consumerism to train his flesh by not wanting those things. And that's the kind of violence that's just, people look at that and they're like, you want me to blind my eyes out? Well, hyperbolically, yes. Figuratively in the story, yes. But she shows it literally. And that's the kind of violence that's like, whoa, it's literal in the story. And it's hard for people to see the spiritual ramification for that.
Yeah. I mean, there's an important use of symbology and signs in O'Connor. And it's as if, I know this will connect with you, it's as if all of the saints in her stories and that blurry line between the sinner and the saint in her stories, they become these kind of living icons as well. And so read in the proper way, it's still not for the faint of heart. And it's not something to bring on your honeymoon, perhaps, to read on the beach. But it's something that is spiritually enriching, and it's more than meets the eye.
Yeah. I mean, it is a devotional literature. It is humorous. Her stories are so funny.
Oh,
I mean,
amen.
It's not like they're torture to read. So, I mean, they're so funny. They're worth reading, but you do have to read them symbolically. Like you have to, what she would not say symbolically. I just used your word. Right. She would say sacramentally or incarnationally. Yeah. So you have to read them in a way that sees the intimate spiritual reality connected through the literal story.
Yep.
Right. But the particular is always necessary. She never gets rid of the particular. Mm-hmm. Those things are intimately connected.
Yeah, that really does come back to the sort of ordinary quotidian element of so much of her storytelling, which just perfectly fits that incarnational mode and that mode of particularity that takes seriously the ordinary things of life.
Yeah, and in my first book, Giving the Devil His Due, I really saw her in light of Dostoevsky. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because one of the traditions that we don't have is this idea of the holy fool that she really takes on in the South. And it looks strange to see this Russian holy fool character, medieval holy fool character in the 20th century South, right? That juxtaposition of executions, she was hoping would just stick with people, like you said, becomes like an icon. So for the holy fool is someone who performed in front of the public to become the scapegoat for the public, on which you could experience the catharsis that you needed to repent of your sins, to want to get rid of your sins, by casting them on this foolish character, right? It was a reminder of God's reality, and how that reality supersedes this reality.
Yeah, there are some truly wonderful instances of the holy fool, honestly, all throughout contemporary culture. And I don't think most people even realize what they're seeing when they see it. Now, this isn't yet another like literary connection, but one of my favorite holy fools is Ignatius J. Reilly from Confederacy of Dunces. And it also another Southern holy fool in a very Thomistic mode, very similar to what O'Connor's bringing. So let's dig into some of this mode of spirituality and a little bit more of the theological side for O'Connor that might be like helping us draw connections to the Holy Fool. We can stick on the Holy Fool for a minute, but I would love to get into some of her Thomism and some of the other kind of theological influences that she's pulling from.
Right. Well, she did read Thomas Aquinas every night, but just like Dante's world looks different from reading the systematic theology of Aquinas, and yet Dante is the artist who embodies Thomism best. Right. But look at what happens when you read Thomas and you see this connection between the body and soul, and you read about the spiritual reality that is invested in the physical reality. And so there's, Dante shows this with hell. Dante shows it with paradise, with purgatory, with things and their signification being intertwined in a way that is especially difficult for Protestants. We're more comfortable with similes, or this is like this. Whereas these writers are focusing more on a metaphoric understanding in which God is a lion, right? Or, this is what sin is, a pit, and they make sin a pit that you fall in.
Yeah, there's something, the sacramental mode, is charged with a kind of metaphysical realism in that Thomistic sense, that it's especially when you compare the Catholic imagination and the Protestant imagination, they're going to part ways on this kind of sacramental vision of the world and seeing these realities just on display. Whether you're thinking about the, like the kind of metaphysical reality of the union that marriage is, or the Eucharist, obviously extremely important. That's a fascinating topic in O'Connor because she is a Catholic writer in the Protestant South.
Yes. And you're bringing up a great point, even looking at the sacraments. I think that's a way to maybe get some particularity to understand what O'Connor's doing. So, for example, her second novel, Violin Bear It Away, she says is a hymn to the Eucharist, right? Because she's always trying to make these things real. There's that famous story of when she was in New York and, someone said something about the Eucharist being a symbol. And she said, if the Eucharist is a symbol, to hell with it. And she meant that literally and spiritually. That's why it's such a clever line, right? Like for her, there was no point in something that was merely symbolic.
Me and my kids would call that a well-placed cuss word.
Agreed. And she was so good about using words in the right way, right? With their full charge, their full meaning. And baptism is another one of those realities that is sacramental that she thought had become merely symbolic, especially being surrounded by the Protestant South. And she wanted to really hit home. This is not a symbolic rite, right? Like a rite of passage or, singing the Star Spangled Banner or something, or like, raising the flag. Like it was not merely a symbolic rite.
Yeah.
It was something that it got in touch with the spiritual reality.
Yeah.
So to be baptized, you were being transfigured by baptism. And so in order for people to get the spiritual reality of that, she had to showcase it in her work. She had to really make readers question, do you believe this is a matter of life and death? Do you think, is it more important for someone to get baptized before death? Or is it more important for them to live a happy life and never be baptized, but also get to live for a long time? Full of self-satisfaction. And so she challenges that by having characters who get baptized and then immediately die.
Yeah.
And she makes you question, because it's in the fiction. It's fiction. You live vicariously through it so much, which is what's wonderful about her work, but it's also what causes people to cringe when they read her work. So Flannery writing sacramentally means that you cannot understand her work unless you go there with her.
Yeah.
She really demands that, because if not, her fiction makes no sense and people walk away being like, that didn't make sense to me. And I get why, because I understand how to read sacramentally.
Yep.
Right. So, the story, the river, a little boy gets drowned, end of story. That's like all that happens if you don't read it spiritually.
Right. Yeah. So you just leave depressed. You don't see anything redemptive at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at Greenleaf, there's two key moments in Greenleaf that only make sense if you read them spiritually. And I'm going to start with the ending, and then I'm going to go backwards to my favorite, which I know we've talked about that scene in Greenleaf.
We have before. I think it is fitting to go to the end because of where we started. I mean, like, this is one of those stories where, is it the chiastic structure of coming back around?
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, really, we've gone full circle in so many ways on this one.
When I was teaching students a week ago, and one of the students was like, she's just such a bad writer. You cannot like what she's doing, but there's not a single person of literary talent that thinks Flannery O'Connor is bad at what she does.
That's not up for debate.
No, yeah, she's a genius. It's not up for debate.
Yeah, there's spoilers in this, so you've been alerted, dear listener. And so we're going to be reading the end in light of the beginning and in light of a lot of these literary principles that Jessica's been talking about. So Jessica, go.
So when the story opens, you see Mrs. May, and she is angry that there's a bull who has disturbed her sleep. And one of the reasons she's angry is the bull doesn't belong to her, and it is on her land. So it's trespassing, right? And so we start to see in the course of the story that she's very possessive about her land. Like, she treats her husband's old office like it's a sanctuary. She talks about it in religious terms because that's where business takes place, right? Like it's this whole notion that the world of business and the world of ownership is her primary world. And her sons, Schofield and Wesley, are both in these jobs that are very parasitic. You know, they're exploiting people to make money off people. They don't make anything. They don't produce anything. And I'm bringing this up because she has this land that is losing money, that is losing business. They're not actually creating anything, her and her sons, right? And even at one point, they raise her hand to make fun of it, and it's like a withered lily. I mean, everything is kind of this. Cale Zeldin is at Portsmouth Abbey, and he and I were co-teaching this, and he pointed out the fertility, which I thought was a really good contrast, that you see the green leaf, hear that name, right? Just the signification.
Yes.
In the Greenleaf family, there's this fertility. They have tons of children. They're farming. They're producing crops. Things are growing. So you have this contrast with this unfertile, parasitic family and this very fertile, voluptuous, life-giving family.
Yeah, a dead family and a living family.
Exactly. And at the same time, she's so envious, but the way that that Mrs. May handles being envious is to want to take away anything that they do have. And so this bull being on her land, she now has the opportunity, because it's trespassing, to kill. So, I mean, everything about her nature is deathly.
Yeah.
And so she's asking Mr. Greenleaf to kill his son's bull that is trespassing on her land. So when we get to this last section, this last couple of pages, she's just letting him go do. Again, she's not doing anything. She's laying on the car and she's waiting on him. And it says that she opens her eyes, but the white light was so bright, she's forced to close them again. So it's an echo of what we saw in the beginning of the story. Silver moonlight was there and she shut the blinds quickly. So she's always closing out the light. And again, this is going to come up as we see the last scene of the story.
Yeah.
And she's sitting there with her eyes closed, reflecting. She says, before any kind of judgment seat, she would be able to say, I've worked, I've not wallowed. What's fascinating about that, of course, is that she's not worked. Like she's just owned. She received this land from her husband. She's done nothing with it. And she's laying there on top of a car while her field hand goes and works. But yet she's going to tell God, I've worked, I've done. And so her only signs of having done is the things she owns.
Yeah.
And that is a sign to her that she's done something, but she hasn't actually done anything. So she can't see clearly. And that's the key for Mrs. May. She cannot see clearly and she will not let the light through. And when story ends, the last paragraphs, she's looking at the tree line and a black, heavy shadow emerges that tossed its head several times and bounded forward. Again, to go back to the Europa myth, if you look at Ovid's Metamorphoses, in the Europa myth, as the bull bounds towards Europa, she's excited and he's excited. It's actually the bounding forward is the bull is in love with the beloved. But because Mrs. May cannot see that, that's not how she sees the bull. Like she doesn't see him that. After a second, she saw it was the bull. He was crossing the pasture at a slow gallop, gay, almost rocking, as if he were overjoyed to find her again. And then, with his head lowered, racing toward her, she remains perfectly still in a freezing unbelief.
Yeah.
So as she sees this joyful bull bounding toward her, it paralyzes her. Instead of causing her to be lit up with joy seeing the lover, right? Again, symbolically, it's a freezing unbelief. It causes her to be paralyzed. She stares at the violent black streak bounding toward her. And then until the bull had buried his head in her lap like a wild, tormented lover, one of his horns sank until it pierced her heart. The other curved around her and held her in an unbreakable grip. She continued to stare straight ahead, but the entire scene in front of her had changed. The tree line was a dark wound in a world that was nothing but sky. And she had the look of a person whose sight has been suddenly restored, but who finds the light unbearable.
Amazing.
It is. And, Flannery was wanting, she was being literal here too. She wrote letters to friends being like, is it possible for a horn to stab through the heart and the side?
I want to check, is this physiologically, biologically, medically accurate?
So she was wanting to make sure it was also literal, but of course that is sacramental. It's Christ, spiritually being pierced through the heart and physically being pierced through the side for us on the cross. Yeah. And then the piercing of the heart goes back to that other moment of Greenleaf we can go into in a second. Yep. But it's pulling that back in. What does it mean to be pierced in the heart by Jesus, by the patient God who woos you? You have that John Donne poem, "Oh, unless you ravish me, I will remain chaste, Lord, unless you ravish me." So this idea of I will only be pure if the Lord is the one who ravishes me. It's so paradoxical. And yet that's what Flannery's doing here, right? She's saying that unless you allow the Lord to pierce through all your barriers, right? Unless you allow him to pierce your heart, you will always be in a pain you don't even realize.
Yeah. What I'm fascinated also by the sense in which there is a kind of, there's a blurring of the lines between the Christ figure here as well, because in one sense, at the beginning of the story, we have the bull as a patient God who is trespassing or viewed as trespassing in this land. And that reads a whole lot like Jesus came to his own and his own received him not, right? Viewing the incarnation as a mode of trespass instead of in a mode of salvation.
Yeah, absolutely. His own did not recognize him. Yeah, that's fantastic.
And yet, as there's this kind of melding, right? So in the ravishing or in the penetration of the bull's horn of her heart, there's this violent union that takes place between the Savior and the sinner. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the violence in Flannery is so fascinating because it will be experienced as painful either way. Yeah. But the one who receives it will be transformed, right? This is, again, C.S. Eliot, from fire to fire, right? Redeemed or damned by the fire. And so it's that idea that either way, you will experience this pain by God, but it will either pierce you and you will be in love with him through that piercing. Yep. Right? Or it pierces you. And in this case of Mrs. May, she finds it unbearable. She can't withstand it. It freezes her in unbelief and she can't move on from it. She's damned by the piercing rather than being broken open by it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. This is to come back to the freezing unbelief. And it's a kind of, it's contrasted with, she's not afraid. Because really, I think in order to be afraid, you have to acknowledge, you have to recognize what's happening. But instead, the emotional or psychological response that she's got when this bull is rushing at her is one of disbelief. She's shocked because this is a reality that she didn't think could happen.
Yes. So good.
And so I want you to say a little bit more about Mrs. May and the kind of Christianity that she embodies, or the kind of morality that she embodies, because she does identify as a good Christian, of course, in this story. I'll let you read that line. But the possessiveness, the kind of privilege of being able to be a wealthy landowner without working, and yet taking credit for that work, and the kind of bliss that follows from her willful ignorance and closing the shades and the blinds and living blindly to these things, is a kind of biting critique of Southern Christianity and the kind of moral attitudes that end up, and the spiritual attitudes that end up forming America. But insofar as the South is a kind of fill-in for Christian America, Bible Belt Christianity, there's a kind of biting critique of that in here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, because she describes Mrs. May as she was a good Christian woman with a large respect for religion, though, of course, she did not believe a word of it was true. And,
that's the line.
I mean, her most famous story was "A good man is hard to find."
Yeah.
The whole story is about the grandmother who so-called believes in Jesus, but nothing in her life shows that she believes in Jesus.
Yeah.
right? And so when it gets to the end of her life, she suddenly has to question, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen, maybe Jesus didn't do what he said. But that one question, she then answers in the affirmative. He did. He did. And if he did, then what does that mean for our lives? And that's what's happening with Mrs. May is she's not questioning, and every opportunity that should allow for a moment of grace. That's Flannery's phrase, moment of grace. Yeah. Every opportunity where a moment of grace could happen, she shuts the blinds. She doesn't let in the light. And that doesn't always happen in Flannery's work. I mean, you always wait to see if the character is going to let in the light, is going to be changed or transfigured. And there's always that opportunity. So whether a character dies or not is kind of irrelevant. It's more of they change before they die or not. Like, do they believe in Jesus before they die?
Right. I mean, and I think you brought up a good man is hard to find. And I think the misfits response to the grandmother's spiritual perspective is so enlightening, that she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. And you wonder about Mrs. May, what might have happened if she had a bull rushing at her to gore her every minute of her life. What kind of new reality would emerge from that? What kind of sainthood would emerge from that?
Could have. I mean, that's kind of the difficulty, is that when she sees the bull rushing towards her, if she would have responded like Europa, right? We have these kind of models in literature that you're drawing from, right? If she would have responded by, yes, take me away with you, even in death, even if it would have been in death, her sight has been restored suddenly, and she finds the light a grace, a gift. She finds the light is what she's always longed for. I mean, it could have been anything, but that's not what happens. Instead, she, like you said, it's freezing unbelief. She doesn't have fear and reverence. When it actually stabs her, she finds the light unbearable, even when her sight is restored. And so the opportunity to have the gun at your head and then decide, yes, I do believe Jesus is the Son of God, right? And died and was resurrected. What happens next, whether you get shot or not, that belief has brought you into reality. And that doesn't happen with Mrs. May. She doesn't get brought into that reality.
Should we read the final paragraph of the story now or after we talk about Miss Greenleaf?
The interesting thing about the final paragraph, sometimes I just don't even want it to be there because I really like the light unbearable, and I'm okay with that. That's fine. Because Flannery's a master at what she does. There are a few paragraphs that I would want to cut from her fiction. That's one of them. So
I do like the last paragraph. And why don't I say why I like it, and you can say why you don't like it. I like it because, one, I like that there is that immediate chiasm of listening, because the story starts off with the bull silvered in the moonlight, standing under it, his head raised as if he listened. And of course, by that final statement, the bull turns out to be listening for this. It's almost hypothetical, right? Because she's gone at this point. She only seems to be bent over whispering some last discovery into the animal's ear, but it's unactualized potential of being able to speak the word back, right? Yeah. That's why I like having that opportunity for that kind of lovely chiasm.
Well, and I do appreciate structurally, like that's a great connection that you're bringing up. Mr. Greenleaf, this is the first time we switch into his perspective. And as I mentioned, the first paragraph is Mrs. May, contrast to Greenleaf. And so here we switch. So you do get an alternative way of envisioning reality.
Got it.
He sees her this way. Yeah. So we realize, like you said, potentiality. She could have seen things the way the Greenleaf saw things. And she doesn't.
Right.
So she could have seen it the way Mr. Greenleaf sees this confessional moment that could have happened. And it is a good contrast because it doesn't, she's already dead.
Right.
At this point.
Well, there's this very important scene in the middle of Greenleaf that I want to make sure you get to speak to, because I know it is one of the most important scenes in all of literature to you.
Mm-hmm. It is. That is not too much to say. Yeah, it means a lot to me. the first time, of course, I read this when I was a teenager. And the first time I read it, I think I had the same approach that everyone else did, is that Mrs. Greenleaf seems crazy. And I was not on her side the first time I read this.
Right.
But then as I, was getting older and older and seeing Flannery within context and understanding what was happening here, I started connecting this more and more with Ivan Karamazov and his litany against God, and seeing the exact opposite approach in Mrs. Greenleaf to Ivan Karamazov. So let me tell you what I mean. In Dostoevsky, Ivan Karamazov is so materialistic, not the sense of like buying clothes. I mean, material, like he only believes in a material world. And so because of that, he lists out all of the suffering children, and he starts cutting up headlines and saving all of these protests against God, wars and people being mistreated and violence in the world. And all of this is his evidence that God is either not all powerful or not all good. And that's what he's left with.
Yeah.
And so he uses those stories this way. Well, Flannery read a lot of Dostoevsky. She was even reading him the last year of her life. She said, she didn't know it was her last days, but she also knew she was very sick. And she's like, I think I'm going to reread Dostoevsky. So what we see in this story is that Mrs. Greenleaf also cuts up newspapers, right? So I'm going to read this paragraph. Yes. Every day, all the morbid stories out of the newspaper, the accounts of women who had been raped, criminals who had escaped, children who had been burned, of train wrecks and plane crashes, and the divorces of movie stars.
Yep. Such a good line.
And she dug a hole and buried them, then fell on the ground over them and mumbled and groaned for an hour or so, moving her huge arms back and forth under her and out again, and finally just lying flat. And Mrs. May suspected going to sleep. So,
wow.
These she calls her prayer healings.
Yep.
Now, again, if you know Dostoevsky, when his characters come to knowledge of God. So Alyosha, after the reading of the Cana in Galilee, where, heaven and earth are married together, water can be turned into wine, and it's being read over the corpse of his elder. So he suddenly has this knowledge of resurrection. He has a vision of Christ and his elder together, that there really is a resurrection. And Alyosha does what? He walks out under the stars and falls face down to hug the earth. It's this openness. The same thing happens to Raskolnikov, who has been divided the whole time. Is it just a material world? Is there nothing else? Then if it's only this world, I can kill this pawnbroker and it's not going to matter. And then it messes with his soul to commit murder and violence. And what does he do when he realizes it? He falls to the earth, wets the earth with his tears, and cries, arms wide open on the ground. So it's this image of what do you do when you realize, when you know that God is real, you open yourself up to that. Like there's an opening that happens with the knowledge of who God is, that you want to hug the whole world, that you want to get, look at that posture. It's the posture of the cross, right? It's the
cruciform. Yep.
Right. It's cruciform. It's suffering on behalf of this world that you love, spreading your arms so wide to receive. It is the exact opposite of the posture spiritually of Mrs. May through this whole story.
Yep.
This woman who has been eyes closed, crossed off, blinds shut, protecting what is hers, holding on tightly to what is hers. It's the opposite. You can't receive love in that posture.
Yeah.
But she's trying to protect herself from pain, right? She's so protecting herself from pain that the Lord has to physically pierce through that guard she has set up against herself.
Mm-hmm.
Contrast to Mrs. May, who, yes, is going to be vulnerable to hurt and pain and the suffering of others. Yeah. But that posture also opens her up to love and to receive and to be given. And so there's this grace that happens with this character that I think really encapsulates all of what Flannery O'Connor is trying to do in her fiction, that when you open yourself up to a spiritual way of seeing the world, it's going to hurt, but it's also going to allow you to receive grace.
Absolutely. There's something wonderful about the posture of that image isn't just cruciform. It isn't just a hug for the world. It's also, it seems like a right placing of a person's humanity. Right? Insofar as we are dust, and to dust we shall return. There's a kind of solidarity, right? That burying those wounds expressed in those newspaper clippings, the headlines, and then and then seeking to be close to them, right? Covering them up and bending down back to the rich humus of the earth.
Yes.
In a posture of humility.
Yeah. And Flannery is, again, she's teaching you how to see in that way.
Yeah.
As her most prideful characters, they always stand, their hands are on their hips, they're on top of hills, right? So overseeing, there's always a posture of being above. They're setting themselves up. But of course, we know scripturally, those who exalt themselves will be lowered. And so some of them are lowered. And when they're lowered, they receive grace. In this case, you have a character who is experiencing that humility, who's, again, showing Mrs. May, if you embraced humility like this, like if you saw yourself humbly as humus, as dirt, right? And to dirt you will return. You would avoid what's coming. You know, the lowering by the bull is a much more violent way that God has to break through to her, that he has to lower her for her to be able to see who she is and see who he is.
Yeah. I wonder if you can bring us into the kind of urgency, though, because I think there's a kind of prophetic mode that's coming on here too, with the Greenleaf family, the Pentecostalism, the kind of radical commitment to the way of Jesus. That is a huge differentiator between Mrs. May and Mrs. Greenleaf.
I can speak to that. So Mrs. May at the end, right before she's gored by the bull, she says, everything in moderation, you know, reflecting on Mrs. Greenleaf. And this is Greenleaf's zeal. Now, Thomas Aquinas, go back to Aquinas. Aquinas says everything in moderation except for zeal for the Lord. Aquinas clarifies the only thing that you can be immoderate in is your zeal for God.
Yeah.
And so O'Connor's playing with that here for anybody who knows Aquinas, that her saying that is missing the second half of the sentence, that the zeal for God is never supposed to be moderated. And Flannery loved writing about Protestants because any zealous Catholic is going to go join a monastery or a convent. And she writes that. Therefore, those who become zealous Protestants, they go out and make fools of themselves in the world. And she could use that dramatically for her fiction, right?
Yeah. I wonder if we could close with just one, bring it back, I think, to being stabbed in the heart. And I think this is one of those practical takeaways, at least for me, in terms of reading O'Connor spiritually, reading her mystically, and the kind of, honestly, it's erotic mysticism that is present in a lot of the medieval mystics who are envisioning the love of God in this kind of pervasive way that elevates one's humanity into a kind of mystical union. And I'm so fascinated by seeing that in the dramatic, in the American, in the Southern, and in the, honestly, just weird. O'Connor is famous for having said, "The truth shall make you weird."
And that's what Mrs. Greenleaf does, right? She lays on the ground and she says, "Oh, Jesus, stab me in the heart, Jesus," right? Like she cries out, she's shrieking, "Jesus, stab me in the heart." Yeah. And this is a performative aspect of looking at these medieval mystics. I mean, you have, Teresa of Avila or, Julian Norwich saying like, "Lord, I want to suffer like you." And Flannery herself prayed that in her prayer journal, right? Where she said, "I believe it takes grace to want to suffer. So Lord, give me the grace I need to withstand the pain." And this is before she ever received lupus. But I think what we have with this kind of mystical desire to suffer for God, which is a call for all of us to suffer for the Lord, right? And so that call to stand out by suffering, Flannery, I think she didn't really ever appreciate the idea that her suffering could be participatory in Christ. I mean, she did theologically, but when people wrote her, "Oh, you must feel so close to God because you suffer so much," that kind of, she had no tolerance for that. But at the same time, she did understand that suffering was not something to be bought out of or to be pushed away, but rather could be seen in light of sharing in God's suffering, theologically, at least.
Any final words, any invitations, or any proclamations to say about O'Connor?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I really would love to read her prayer. And I think that in this opening prayer journal, It makes references in some ways to what will become Greenleaf, even though this is written, almost 15 years maybe before.
Wow.
Right? And yet, so she's praying and she says, "Dear God, I cannot love thee the way I want to. You are the slim crescent of a moon that I see, and myself is the earth's shadow that keeps me from seeing all the moon. The crescent is very beautiful, and perhaps that is all one like I am, should, or could see. But what I'm afraid of, dear God, is that my self-shadow will grow so large that it blocks the whole moon, and that I will judge myself by the shadow. That is nothing. I do not know you, God, because I am in the way. Please help me to push myself aside. Please help me to get down under things and find where you are." And it's such a vision of wanting to see the light and being afraid that you are going to block out the light. So this idea of writing about Mrs. May is not from a place of condemnation.
Yeah.
It's a place of vulnerability in which Flannery sees herself in these characters. And she knows that each of us have the potential to be Mrs. May. But she also knows that we have the potential to be Mrs. Greenleaf if we pray, "Lord, help us dig down under things and find where you are."
Jessica, you have only deepened my love for O'Connor, and I hope the same for our listeners. Thanks for joining us here.
Thank you.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured Jessica Hooten Wilson. Production assistance by Macy Bridge, Alexa Rollo, and Tim Bergland. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu, where you can find past episodes, articles, books, and other educational resources to help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity. If you're new to the show, we're grateful you're listening. Remember to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. To our loyal supporters and faithful listeners, though, we have a humble request. If you'd share this episode with a friend, we'd greatly appreciate it. Or you could give us an honest rating or review in Apple Podcasts. We want to know how we're doing. We'd love to hear your feedback about what you love or how we can improve. Thanks again for listening, friends. We'll be back with more soon.